There are moments that seem small. A seat on a plane, a word spoken too loudly, a look given too freely. But some of those moments are not small at all. They are ancient. And in the spring of 1975, at 33,000 feet above America, one woman was about to learn exactly how ancient they could be. He did not draw attention to himself when he boarded. That was never his way. He wore a simple jacket, dark and quiet, and carried a small leather bag that looked like it had been on a few long journeys. He moved through the jetway the way most people do, one foot in front of the other, head slightly bowed to clear the frame of the cabin door. He found his seat. He settled in. He looked out the window at the tarmac below and said nothing at all. Seat 2A, first class. He was 33 years old, and in those 33 years, he had done things that most people only ever read about. He had won a gold medal at the Olympic Games in Rome at the age of 18. He had defeated the most feared heavyweight champion in the world when everyone said it was impossible. He had stood alone in a room in Houston, Texas, and refused an order given by the United States government, and paid for it with 3.5 years of his life and everything he had earned in the ring. He had been called a criminal and a traitor and a disgrace. He had been loved by millions and hated by millions more, and he had come through all of it the same way he had come through the cabin door that morning, quietly, steadily, with nothing to prove to anyone. He asked the flight attendant for a glass of water when she came by. Just water. She brought it. He thanked her. He turned back to the window. Outside, the sky was the pale gray of a morning that had not yet decided what kind of day it wanted to be. That was when the commotion started at the front of the cabin. A voice, sharp, clear, carrying the particular confidence of someone who expected to be heard. The man in seat 2A did not turn around immediately. He had heard voices like that before. He had heard them all his life. The first-class cabin, which had been quiet and unhurried, went still. Not a dramatic stillness, just the kind of quiet that falls over a room when the people in it sense that something is about to go very wrong. If you believe every person deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are or where they sit, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story is already making you feel something, subscribe now, because what comes next will stay with you. The year was 1975. The country was still finding its way out of one of the longest and most painful decades in its history. The Vietnam War had finally ended. The civil rights movement had won legal battles that had taken generations to fight. But winning on paper and winning in practice were two different things. Everybody knew it. You could feel it in the air of places like airports and hotels and restaurants. The unspoken question of who belonged where. First class in particular had a way of being a room within a room. The seats were wider. The food was better. The quiet was a different kind of quiet. Purchased, private, protected. The people who sat there had learned to carry themselves in a certain way. Not louder than everyone else necessarily, but more certain, more sure that the space they occupied was the space they deserved. The man in seat 2A carried himself differently. His certainty was not about the seat. It had never been about any seat. It was something that sat deeper, in the way he held his shoulders, in the stillness of his hands resting flat on his knees, in the calm of his breathing. He had spent his entire life being told, in ways large and small, that he did not fully belong in the rooms he entered. He had responded to that message every single time by simply not moving. He was thinking about something. What? No one around him knew. Maybe the upcoming fight he was training for. Maybe his children. Maybe nothing in particular at all. His eyes were soft, distant, the way a person's eyes get when they are somewhere their body is not. He looked like a man who had learned to find his own quiet and carry it with him wherever he went. She came through the forward cabin door 3 minutes after he had settled in. Mid-40s, dressed well, the kind of expensive that announced itself without shouting. A fitted coat, a handbag that cost more than some people's monthly wages. Her hair was neat and her posture was straight, and she moved with the ease of a woman who was used to getting what she wanted without having to ask twice. She scanned the first-class cabin the way a person scans a room they believe they already own. Her eyes moved across the faces and the seats, checking, assessing, confirming that everything was as it should be. And then her eyes reached seat 2A. They stopped, Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, not in a way most people would have noticed, but it was there. A slight pulling together of the brows, a tightening around the mouth, a decision made before a single word had been spoken. She did not go to him. She turned instead to the flight attendant, a young woman named Claire who was checking seat pockets at the back of the first-class section. The woman approached her and spoke quietly. Claire listened. And then something moved across Claire's face too. Something careful, professional, trained. The face of a person who had just been asked to do something they were not going to enjoy doing. The man in seat 2A still had not turned around. He was watching the sky outside his window begin to lighten. The gray was lifting. Somewhere beneath it there might have been blue. Claire walked up the aisle slowly. She stopped beside seat 2A and offered a polite smile, the kind that flight attendants are trained to give in moments they would rather not be part of. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "I'm sorry to bother you. There seems to be a question about the seating in this row." The man in seat 2A turned from the window. He looked at Claire. Then he looked past her briefly to where the woman in the fitted coat was standing near the front of the cabin with her arms folded. He looked back at Claire. His face was calm, completely calm. Not the calm of someone who didn't understand what was happening, the calm of someone who understood it perfectly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. He held it out. Claire took it, looked at it, and gave a small nod. Seat 2A, his name, the flight number, everything correct. "Thank you," Claire said. She turned and walked back toward the woman. The woman looked at the boarding pass for only a second. Then she handed it back to Claire and shook her head. Her voice was pleasant on the surface, the kind of pleasant that is really armor. "There must have been some kind of confusion with the seating," she said. "I just think it might be better if the matter were handled properly." Claire began to speak. The woman spoke over her. "This is first class," she said, and then, quieter, but not quiet enough, "I just don't think this is the right environment for everyone." The cabin heard it. Every person in first class heard it. She had not said what she really meant. She hadn't needed to. The pause around the word environment said everything the words themselves did not. A businessman 2 rows back looked down at his newspaper. The older couple across the aisle looked at each other. A younger woman seated near the window looked directly at the man in seat 2A, and what was in her eyes was not pity. It was recognition. She had heard language like that before, too. The man in seat 2A had not moved. He had not raised his voice, had not shifted in his seat, had not done any of the things a person might reasonably do when they are told, in a crowded cabin, that they do not belong there. He looked at the woman for a long moment, and then he said, simply and quietly, "Ma'am, this is my seat." He said it the way a person states a fact. No argument in it, no plea, no anger. Just the truth, spoken plainly, by a man who had long ago decided that the truth did not need to be delivered with fire to be real. The woman turned back to Claire. Her voice had an edge to it now. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," she said. Immediately, Claire gave a single nod. She walked to the rear of the cabin, and the first-class section, which had already gone quiet, went quieter still. The kind of quiet that tells you something has just been set in motion that cannot easily be stopped. That was the moment that sealed everything that came next. Have you ever been told you didn't belong somewhere? Not because of anything you did, but because of who you are? Tell me in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because this story is only just getting started. The supervisor's name was David. He was a trim man in his 40s with silver at his temples, and the practiced steadiness of someone who had managed difficult situations at 30,000 feet more times than he could count. He came up the aisle with Claire behind him, took in the scene in a few seconds, and introduced himself to the woman with a quiet courtesy that gave nothing away. She explained the situation, her version of it. There had been a mix-up, she said, a seating issue. She gestured towards seat 2A without looking at the man in it directly. David listened to her the way experienced people listen, patiently, without interrupting, giving no indication of what he was thinking. When she finished, he asked to see both boarding passes. She handed hers over. David walked to seat 2A. The man there produced his boarding pass again, without being asked. He held it out with the ease of a man who had already been through this once, and expected he might be going through it again. David looked at the pass. He looked at the seat number on the overhead panel. He looked at the pass again. He turned back to the woman. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I've reviewed both boarding passes. This gentleman has a valid ticket for seat 2A. I'm not able to ask him to move." The woman stared at David for a moment. Then something behind her eyes shifted. "Then I'd like to speak to the captain," she said. It was not a request. David gave a small nod and moved to the front of the cabin. The passengers nearby were very still. No one looked directly at anyone else. The younger woman near the window had stopped reading her book. The businessman had given up the pretense of his newspaper entirely. In seat 2A, the man was quiet. His hands were still resting on his knees. He was not watching what was happening around him with the alertness of a man waiting for a fight. He was somewhere else in his mind. And if you had known even a fraction of what that mind had carried, if you had known about the diner in Louisville where he had sat with an Olympic gold medal around his neck and been told they didn't serve his kind, if you had known about the title that had been ripped from him not by any opponent in a ring, but by men in suits in government offices, if you had known about the years he had given up and the millions he had lost and the name they had kept calling him that was not his name, you would have understood why this woman, with her boarding pass and her fitted coat and her certainty, was not the most powerful force that had ever tried to move him. She was simply the latest one, and not one of them had succeeded. Captain James Hargrove stepped out of the cockpit. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 20 years making hard decisions and had learned not to let any of them show on his face. He looked at David. David spoke to him quietly. Hargrove gave a small nod, took both boarding passes from David's hand, and looked at them. He looked at the woman's pass. Then he looked at the one belonging to the man in seat 2A. His eyes moved across the information on it in the careful way of someone reading something for the first time. And then something in his posture changed. It was subtle, almost nothing, but it was there. He turned to the woman. His voice was measured. "Ma'am," he said, "the passenger is in his correct seat. I'm going to have to ask you to take yours." The woman was silent for a moment. The kind of silence that is not empty but full of the recalculation of someone who expected a different outcome. "I want a full report filed," she said finally. "I want the airline to know what happened here today." Captain Hargrove nodded once. "We'll make sure of that," he said. He had no idea in that moment just how right he was. This story is about to turn in a way she never saw coming. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because what happens in the next few minutes changes everything. Captain Hargrove stood at the front of the cabin with both boarding passes still in his hand. He had started to turn back toward the cockpit, and then he stopped. He looked down at the boarding pass again, the one belonging to the man in seat 2A. He read it the way a person reads something a second time when the first time didn't quite register. His eyes moved slowly across the name printed there. They stopped. He looked up. He looked at the man sitting quietly by the window. He looked back down at the name on the pass. For 3 full seconds, Captain James Hargrove did not move. Then he turned to David and said something low and brief. David looked at the boarding pass. David looked at seat 2A. And then David looked away. Quickly, the way you look away from something that suddenly makes sense of everything that came before it, and makes you wish you had understood it sooner. Claire was standing 3 steps behind them. She had been watching the whole thing from the moment the woman had first approached her. She was 26 years old, and she had grown up in a household where certain names were spoken with a particular kind of reverence. Names that belonged to people who had done something real in the world, something lasting, something that reached past sports and politics and decades into the simple territory of who a person was. She saw David's face. She looked at the boarding pass in Hargrove's hand. She read the name from where she stood. She put her hand over her mouth, just for a moment, just long enough for it to mean something. Then she was composed again, professional. But her eyes, for the rest of that flight, would carry something different in them. Captain Hargrove turned back toward the cabin. He walked the few steps to seat 2A with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing each word before he opened his mouth. The man by the window turned to look at him. His expression had not changed. It was the same face it had been since he boarded, open, unhurried, unbothered in the deepest sense of the word. Not because nothing had happened, but because he had decided, a long time ago, that his peace was not something other people got to take from him. Hargrove cleared his throat. "Mr. Ali," he said, "I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience." 2 words. Mr. Ali. They were not shouted. They were not announced. They were spoken in the ordinary voice of a man trying to do the right thing, quietly, in a narrow aisle at the front of a first-class cabin. But those 2 words fell through that space the way a stone falls through still water. The rings spread out. They could not be stopped. The businessman 2 rows back closed his laptop, slowly, without looking up. The older woman across the aisle brought her hand to her lips. The younger woman near the window, the one who had recognized the coded language from the very beginning, the one who had watched all of it with that particular expression of someone who already knew the shape of what they were seeing. She let out a long, slow breath, as if she had been holding it since the moment the fitted coat walked through the cabin door. And the woman who had started all of it stood in the aisle. She did not move. She did not speak. She stood with a very specific kind of stillness, the stillness of someone who has just felt the ground shift beneath them, who has just understood something that cannot be walked back, that cannot be reworded or reframed or softened into something easier to live with. She had decided, before a single word had been spoken, that she knew everything she needed to know about the man in seat 2A. And she had been wrong. Completely, entirely, undeniably wrong. And every person in that cabin knew it. And she knew they knew it. The man in seat 2A did not smile. He did not lean back with the satisfaction of a person who has been proven right. He did not look at the woman with anything that could be called triumph. He simply nodded, once, at Captain Hargrove, the small, composed nod of a man who expected nothing more than what he was owed, and turned back to his window. Outside, the clouds were exactly the same as they had been before any of this started, white and slow and enormous, moving across the blue in no particular hurry. The real question, the narrator thought, was never who he was. Anyone in that cabin could have told you who he was, if they had simply looked at the boarding pass. The real question, the one that hung in the air of that cabin long after the captain returned to the cockpit and the flight attendants resumed their duties and the hum of the engines filled the silence again, was who she was going to be. Now that she knew. The flight settled back into its rhythm. The engines hummed. The attendants moved quietly through the cabin. People returned to their books and their thoughts, and the particular private world that long flights create around a person. The woman had taken her seat. Not another seat. The one across the aisle from him, the one that had been hers all along. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes forward and said nothing. Her posture was still straight, but something inside it had changed. The certainty was gone. In its place was something quieter and harder to carry. Claire brought him a second glass of water without being asked. She set it down gently on his tray and said, "Here you are, sir." She said it the way you say something when words are not really the point, when what you mean is something closer to, "I'm sorry, and I see you, and I'm glad you stayed." He thanked her by name. The woman heard that. She watched Claire walk away, and something in the simple exchange, his knowing her name, his thanking her like she was a person worth thanking, landed on the woman in a way that the reveal itself had not quite reached. Because the reveal had been about who he was. This was about who he had always been. He did not look at her for a long moment. He was watching the clouds again. When he finally spoke, it was not loud, and it was not sharp, and it was not directed at her like an accusation. It was the voice of a man thinking aloud, slowly, clearly, the way people speak when they have long since stopped needing to perform their feelings for anyone. "My mother used to tell me," he said, "that respect is the one thing you can give away and still have more of." He let that sit in the air between them. Then he turned and looked at her directly. Not with coldness, not with the satisfaction of a man settling a score, with something that was harder to receive than anger, something that looked, if you were honest about it, like compassion. The specific compassion of a person who has been wronged enough times to understand, deeply, why people wrong each other. "You didn't see me," he said. "You looked right at me and you didn't see me at all. And I want you to understand something. That says nothing about me. It says everything about what you decided before you got here." He paused. Then, "The most dangerous thing in the world isn't a man you don't know. It's the judgment you make before you do. She did not answer, but she did not look away. And in the simple fact that she held his gaze and did not flinch from it, something began. Small, maybe, uncertain, but real. He turned back to the window. He had said what he had to say. He did not need anything from her in return. He never had. This is the kind of story the world needs right now. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs this reminder today. And tell me, what would you have done in that cabin? The plane landed at 2:30 in the afternoon. The passengers gathered their bags and filed toward the exits in the slow, shoulder-to-shoulder way of people who are relieved to be on the ground again. The woman stood in the aisle. He stood beside her. Two people waiting to disembark, equal in that at least. She spoke first, quietly. "I'm sorry," she said. Just those two words. Nothing attached to them. No explanation, no defense, no footnote. Just the two words themselves, offered plainly, the way an apology sounds when it is real. He looked at her. "I know," he said, and then he stepped back and gestured for her to go ahead of him. She hesitated for just a moment. Then she moved. He followed, and that was that. In the terminal, it started slowly. One person recognized him near the gate, then two. Then a small crowd gathered the way crowds always gathered around him, not rushing, not grabbing, just drawn in, the way people are drawn toward something that gives off its own kind of light. He greeted each person with patience. He shook hands. He smiled. Not a performance of a smile, but the real kind, the kind that starts in the eyes. A child, no more than 7 years old, tugged at the sleeve of his jacket. The boy looked up at him with the wide, uncomplicated seriousness that only very young children can manage. "Are you really the greatest?" the boy asked. He bent down, all the way down, to eye level, so that the boy did not have to look up at him. So they were simply two people looking at each other. "I'm one of them," he said. "So are you. Don't let anyone tell you different." Muhammad Ali had been refused service in a diner in his hometown while wearing an Olympic gold medal. He had been stripped of his title by a government that called him a criminal. He had been told in 100 different ways, by 100 different people, in 100 different rooms, that he did not belong, that he was too loud, too proud, too sure of himself, too much. He had been called by a name that was not his name, long after he had chosen the name that was, and he had never moved, not once, not for any of them. The woman stood at the edge of the crowd and watched him with the other passengers. She watched him kneel for a child. She watched him remember the name of a flight attendant. She watched him shake the hand of a man who was visibly trembling at the chance to touch the hand of someone he had admired his whole life. And she understood, in the way you only understand some things when it is almost too late, that she had not been sitting next to a famous man on that plane. She had been sitting next to a free one. And the most extraordinary thing about him, greater than any title, greater than any fight, greater than any name they had ever called him or refused to call him, was this. He had always known it. Even when no one else did. Even when the whole weight of the world was telling him otherwise. He had always known exactly who he was. And he had simply stayed. Subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded today that dignity is not something that can be taken from you. It is something you carry, just like he did.